lucky to have, okay, this meeting is being recorded. We're also lucky to have Dr. Nama Rokem as our respondent. She's a scholar of modern Hebrew and German Jewish literature. Her first book, Heinrich Heine and the Spaces of Zionist Literature, concerns one of my favorite thinkers, and she's now writing a book about the encounter between Paul Celan and Yehuda Amichai, and is a professor at the University of Chicago. I, again, want to thank you all for coming to this, and I'm going to pass the microphone over to Marc now.
I want to begin by thanking Dustin Atlas for this invitation. I also want to thank Alison Gowanluck for all of her technical assistance, which has made this whole event possible. And indeed, I want to thank Nama Rokem for agreeing to read my manuscript at a very early stage of production, as well as to appear tonight, share the screen with me tonight to discuss what I have done in refining my arguments after her well-observed and well-taken critiques. It's a dark night, it's a cold night. For some of us, it might be even a depressing night. So I want to take you to a warmer, happier, safer time. Interwar Berlin. Let me begin our conversation this evening by describing the book that I want to assure Dustin, in spite of his suspicions, that I did in fact actually write. This is a book about the reciprocal encounter between Eastern European Jews and German culture, concentrating primarily on a small group of avant-garde Yiddish writers working in Berlin during the Weimar Republic, taken in comparison with corresponding figures working in German language literature, critical theory, journalism, and film. Its first part considers David Bergelsen, a Yiddish writer who lived in Berlin from 1921 to 1933, in comparison with the German Jewish writer Alfred Döblin. The second part of the book focuses on two narratives by the Yiddish modernist Dan Nister, the Hidden One, the pen name of Pinchas Kahanovich, that bookend his stay in Germany from the years 1921 to 1926. To contextualize Dan Nister's writing and to elaborate on the correspondences between Yiddish and German cultures, I consider his narratives in comparison with the early 19th century Hasidic storyteller Reb Nachman of Breslov, Reb Nachman's German language contemporary E.T.A. Hoffmann, and the 1930 German film The Blue Angel, directed by the Austrian-American filmmaker Josef von Sternberg. The third part of the book examines themes of nostalgia, apocalypse, and the aestheticization of religious concepts in interwar Jewish culture. It begins with a parodically syncretic 1930 German novel, Hiob, Job, by Josef Roth, who traveled from his native Galicia at the border separating the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Pale of Settlement to Vienna, then to Berlin, then to Paris, to work as one of the most successful German language authors during the Weimar Republic. From Roth, the focus turns to the Yiddish writer Moshe Kolbach, who lived in Berlin from 1920 to 1924 and produced two of his greatest early achievements there, the 1922 narrative poem Reisen, Yellow-Russia, and in 1924, his first prose narrative, Mashiach ben Ephraim, the Messiah of the House of Ephraim. The three Yiddish authors who provide the primary focus of this comparison, Bergelsen, Dan Nister, and Kolbach, are among the most innovative and distinctive members of the Yiddish avant-garde during the era of high modernism. Interpreting their writing through aesthetic categories developed in the Weimar Republic is intended to advertise their centrality to modernist aesthetics, not in spite of their peripheral culture and language, but because it is from the periphery, whether defined in geographic, cultural, or social terms, that modernism articulates its critique of modernity. Because they were temporary residents of Berlin, these figures were peripheral in all three senses of the term I am proposing, and yet their presence in the Weimar Republic is representative of a larger phenomenon of refugees from the East, both Jewish and non-Jewish, seeking reprieve from the political instability and physical dangers of life in regions such as Russia, the former Pale of Settlement, following World War I, and during the chaos ensuing from the breakup of the Tsarist Empire in the years 1917 to 1922. As Oleg Budnitsky writes of the demographics of these refugees, quote, according to a 1925 census, there were 253,069 former citizens of the Russian Empire, according to the borders of 1914, living in Germany. Only 80,000 of them were ethnic Russians. Of the Russian immigrants, 63,500 were Jews and 59,000 what were known as Russian Germans. End of quote. Budnitsky goes on to state that more than a quarter of all Russian refugees coming to Germany were Jews, and depending on whom and when one is counting, somewhere between 25,000 and 90,000 of the 100 to 300,000 Russian refugees in Berlin during the Weimar Republic were Jewish. However, counterintuitively, any study of Weimar's fugitive aesthetics must begin with a consideration of Berlin's relationship to Eastern Europe. This is not only because of the status of Yiddish writers living in Berlin as recent and temporary refugees from the former Tsarist Empire. The Soviet Union was also a subject of fascination, fear, and idealization for Germans as much as it was for once and future Soviet citizens, and ambivalent attraction and anxiety toward the communist society unfolding there registers across the political spectrum. As books such as Arnold Zweig's 1920 ethnographic essay, The Face of East European Jewry, demonstrate, a vanguard of Jewish, mostly Zionist German intellectuals had begun to take interest in East European Jewish culture before the establishment of the Weimar Republic. But following the October Revolution, both the development of communism in Russia, as well as the influx of Jewish refugees to Berlin, offered new objects of contemplation and new venues for interaction. Joseph Sherman thus describes David Bergelson's involvement in the establishment of one such gathering place for the East and the West, Berlin's Sholem Aleichem Club. And I quote Sherman. Situated in a large apartment on the Savigny Platz, it soon became popular in Jewish emigre circles for its excellent Ashkenazi cuisine, offering Yiddish speakers a Hamish alternative to the city's other cafes and lessening their sense of social and cultural isolation. It hosted evening lectures, discussions, and charity concerts, at one of which Bergelson and Albert Einstein performed together as violin soloists. Now, that is a recording I would like to have heard. For the Yiddish writers themselves, the eventual and eventually fatal draw back to the Soviet Union, as well as the traumatic circumstances in which they fled their lands of origin, provide an explanation for why Berlin figures only superficially and always in negative terms in their work. Indeed, the unfinished psychic and political work left at home prevented what I'm calling the Weimar Yiddishists from feeling settled in their place of refuge. The break these writers had made with their place of origin was too tentative to enable them to commit to life or to work in Berlin. As Sherman documents in his essay on Bergelson, the many Hebrew language authors who active in Berlin during the same era were able to rationalize their sojourn there as a temporary means of financing their imminent relocation to Palestine. The Yiddish writers in Berlin, however, knew that their writing was being published for export, either back to Eastern Europe or for the American Yiddish press. Yet their location in Berlin provoked the derision of compatriots still in Poland or in the Soviet Union, as well as feelings of guilt, betrayal, and illegitimacy among themselves. As Sherman quotes Danister in a letter from 1923, quote, "In Berlin, it's a disaster. The Yiddish intelligentsia has been left here without roots, and they rot away individually and collectively. Some kind of action is demanded. Summon us to America or to anywhere else you wish." End of quote. For both temperamental as well as political reasons, America was not a feasible option for writers such as Kulbach, Bergelson, or Denister. And Poland, by the end of the decade, offered even less financial or political security than Berlin did. The pull of the Soviet Union would prove irresistible to each of these writers. Yet what is of greatest interest about their Berlin period, to me at least, is neither the inevitability of their departure from Germany, nor their rationale for returning to the East, but the aesthetic and emotional complexity of what they managed to create while living in Germany. Confusion and ambivalence are what make the Weimar Yiddishists true representatives of their time and place. The influx of East European refugees coincides with a massive population growth and geographical expansion of the Berlin city limits. Along with rapid industrialization and the creation of a consciously modernist architectural style, the radical social transformation from a militaristic authoritarian empire to a democratic and at times anarchic republic signifies the way in which Germany had become a foreign country for the native born as much as for the refugees. The traumas inflicted by economic chaos, at least before the period of stabilization ushered in by currency reforms in 1923, as well as the presence of crippled, disfigured, and psychologically battered ex-soldiers, amplified this estrangement with echoes of defeat, despair, and destruction. Though linguistically foreign and socially other, refugees in Berlin participated in and contributed to a general sense of dislocation attested to throughout interwar German culture among all ideologies. By concentrating on the aesthetic character of the Yiddish literature produced in Weimar Germany, my comparison conceptualizes the social history in formal terms. This study therefore offers a new method of seeing how artistic creation is constructed and of understanding the political resonances that result from these structures. At the heart of this study is the critical theory of Walter Benjamin. Benjamin's ideas relating to the status of the fragment, language, history, and spectacle provide a model for characterizing the aesthetic problems that this study considers. Moreover, as a participant in Weimar culture, particularly its radical, cosmopolitan Jewish avant-garde, Benjamin's work provides the ideal source for allowing Berlin modernism to critique itself. His mostly hapless career was in part motivated by the same anxious allure of the Soviet Union that determined the fate of the Yiddish authors in Berlin, of whom he was otherwise unaware. And although the animating concern of his work seems far removed from the traumatic uprooting of East European Jewry, his preoccupation with a profane mysticism resonates with the poetics of these Yiddish authors. The anticipatory character of his writing, its ability to introduce new perspectives by recalling abandoned technologies and superseded aesthetics, provide a means to connect Weimar culture to contemporary postmodernism for all the differences between our epoch and theirs. Just as Benjamin sees cultural productions as an explanatory model for the relationship of the past to the present, the achievements of Weimar modernism, including Benjamin's own writing, serve as a resource for understanding the status of contemporary aesthetics, its significance for the future that every era designated by the prefix post maintains. There are three concepts, or in Benjamin's parlance, constellations that recur with specific resonance throughout my work: allegory, the Baroque, and melancholy. Of the three, allegory requires the most detailed explication, in part because the term has attracted such extensive critical debate, in part because the distinctive significance of this concept to the development of Yiddish literature has been so little remarked upon in previous critical sources. Allegory is a trickier term to understand than other representational strategies because it hinges on a double substitution and consequently on a double illusion. Allegory depends on an irreparably unstable relationship between signifier and signified, while at the same time it poses as offering an absolute connection between the terms of an equation that it exposes nevertheless as arbitrary. Indeed, Benjamin offers the most succinct and suggestive definition of allegory when he writes, quote, "That which the allegorical intention has fixed upon is sundered from the customary contexts of life. It is at once shattered and preserved. Allegory holds fast to the ruins. It offers the image of a petrified unrest." End quote. Allegory manifests itself as a performance of indeterminacy, masquerading as the imposition of a final and irrefutable truth. Characteristics of allegory nevertheless manifest themselves consistently. Specifically, allegory emerges at a conjunction of concept and image, thought and expression, the verbal and the visual. Allegory is not a genre or even an interpretive technique, so much as a rhetorical effect stranded between polarities of metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor thus functions as a mode of enchantment, endowing the objects of its equations with a capacity for transformation and suggesting an illusion of organic relationship to its poetic construction. Metonymy likewise establishes a relationship of apparent contingency, predicated on the material circumstances of its conjunctions. Allegory, by contrast, is a mode of consubstantiation, reiterating the indivisibility of the physical and the abstract, and thereby offering an eschatological relationship of objects and concepts, nonetheless lacking in transcendence. For this reason, allegorical representations typically stress two features: an iconography characterized by the corpse, the skeleton, or the skull, and the muteness of either objects or subjects, the inability of a figure or image to speak for itself. The association of allegory with debilitation, disfigurement, and death makes it an apt strategy for depicting the body in extremis, and therefore accounts for its uses in the portrayal of warfare, madness, and despair. One of the determinant factors for the significance of allegory to the aesthetics of the Weimar period is the legacy of World War I, which in both physical and social terms introduced an unprecedented level of violence against the body and the body politic. In Yiddish literature, one of the great narratives devoted to the destructive impact of the war on traditional Jewish life is Churban Galicia, The Destruction of Galicia, by Shin Ansky, which beyond its documentary value, offers an array of allegorical strategies for depicting the psychic consequences of the war's violence on Jews caught and displaced in its path. In one episode, Ansky records the testimony of a woman from the town of Dembitsa, who has taken refuge in the nearby town of Tarnov. After dispassionately describing the disappearance of her children and grandchildren in the bombings and pogroms that befell her hometown, she suddenly breaks her monotone to bewail the desecration of Torah scrolls and the slaughter of horses during the same sequence of atrocities. Caught between the physical violence of the pogrom and the mechanized violence of the bombing, the refugee allegorically equates the fate of her children simultaneously, but only implicitly, with the slaughter of helpless animals and the destruction of sacred objects. Her ability to bemoan the fate of horses and Torah scrolls instead of her own offspring affects the reader, not because the loss of these animals or these artifacts is commensurate with her murder, that is, the murder of her family members, but because it is not. The inadequacy of language that allegory enacts is the only form of representation that offers a voice for what cannot be said. One similarly sees some of the same characteristics of allegory at work in Arnold Zweig's The Face of East European Jewry, which offers an exemplary illustration of how allegory functions in the works I'm considering, as when he writes of East European Jewish women, and I quote, "In the wide eyes of these girls, you see the innocent tranquility, the trusting nature of organic creatures who gladly exchange a word with humans, because humans are created in God's image, and friendliness is their commandment, who withdraw disconcerted and wounded when the Westerner claims that there is an erotic feeling at play here, and then maintains that he is witnessing a kind of cryptic flirtatiousness. Look at these innocent, full lips that are nothing more than childlike." Whereas the European, raised on the catchwords of operettas, thinks he is discerning sensuality, anticipating the mass-produced kitsch fantasies to which the Jewish woman is subjected, that racial traits such as dark eyes and black hair cannot prevent either soldier or student from wanting to make love to a dusky female Jew, Pole, or Spaniard. Not all girls have the sensitivity of their souls written across their mouths or on their parted lips. Rarely does melancholy stand plainly between their curved eyebrows, and the pointed oval of their face and its outline does not often tremble from alienation so expressively as in these days. End quote. Zweig here reads the faces of the young women he encounters, in part because they lack a shared language through which to communicate, but equally because the purpose of his portraiture is to present an ideal composite rather than an individual. From the organic creature that he describes, the author constructs a timeless abstraction, deprived of context and self-definition, that denies her the living presence that he otherwise extols as the natural source of her praiseworthiness. The face serves as an emblem, and not only does Zweig project a sequence of meanings onto it, but these meanings serve as a series of negations. The Jewish woman is virtuous, tranquil, yet vulnerable because she is not modern, not Western, not German. Moreover, with these negations, Zweig confers and denies the femininity of the Jewish woman because her eroticism, which is both present and absent, functions only as a misreading from the Western male, the author himself. Zweig's imposition of a series of moral qualities onto the neutral features of the East European Jews he surveys is hardly unique among ethnographers. And the conclusions he draws from his own implications are far more benign than either a great deal of anthropological observations of racial others in his day, or the competing stereotypes about Eastern European Jews among Western Jews and non-Jews. What is fundamental to anthropological or ethnographical research of the era, and intrinsically connected to the function of allegory, is the perception of the other as not only culturally, ethnically, or even biologically different, but also as the inhabitant of a remnant of a bypassed historical dispensation. As Angus Fletcher has written on the historical disconnection between a medieval worldview and the historical circumstances of the Elizabethan period, quote, "One could hardly imagine an English author more addicted to medieval allegory than Edmund Spenser. And yet he conveys a strong sense of current political events and a general historicity colliding with archaic myth. In that way, Spenser, for all his medieval yearnings and leanings, is a modern, forcing his vast allegory to think more and more about current historical pressures," end quote. One might suggest in more dialectical terms that Spenser, like other allegorists of the Renaissance, illustrates the collision of medieval conceptual categories with their newly modern usurpers and despoilers. Allegorical figuration captures the inadequacy of medieval rhetoric to represent the violent upheaval of the modern world, in conflict with the inability of modernity to generate conceptual models rapidly enough to convey the world onto which the poet has stumbled. This same collision of the obsolescent with the contemporary encapsulates, more than 300 years after Edmund Spenser, the phenomenon of Yiddish modernists such as Kolbach, Danister, and Bergelsen, or, in a separate medium, though the same cultural milieu, Marc Chagall, carrying the vestiges of Jewish observance from the shtetl to an urban encounter with Russian symbolism and German expressionism. On the other side of this dialectic is the phenomenon of German Jewish intellectuals such as Arnold Zweig, Alfred Döblin, Joseph Roth, and especially Walter Benjamin, whose disillusionment with the ostensible rationality and seeming secularity of the modern world, revealed by the upheavals of World War I to be as much of a mystification as the pieties of bygone centuries, led them in turn to an embrace of various forms of deritualized mysticism. In both the Yiddish and the German halves of this comparison, one observes a disenchantment with disenchantment, expressed allegorically as a recourse to visual imagery teamed with a lack of confidence in the knowledge produced by empirical means, a disillusion of faith in the world observable only through the physical senses. There's much more that could be said about the concept of allegory, but by way of introduction, I want to turn now to the concept of the Baroque, both in Benjamin's distinctive usage of the term and my own even more expansive adaptation of it in this book. For Benjamin, the Baroque is an aesthetic practice characterized by a series of contradictions: meticulous ornamentation and ruinous fragmentation, solemnity and failure, splendor and shadows, majesty and melancholy. The central concept that animates his thinking on Baroque aesthetics is the Trauerspiel, roughly the play of mourning, a 17th century dramatic genre that Benjamin examines in the German context. The characteristics of the Trauerspiel include its pageantry and spectacle, its focus on intrigue and the theory of the state, and its preference, in contrast with classical or Renaissance tragedy, with historical or at least legendary settings rather than mystical or supernatural ones. Of greatest significance for Benjamin's study is the repudiation of transcendence in favor of the immanence of the human body, and the term common to most Trauerspiele, of the tyrant into a martyr, or, correspondingly, of a martyr into a tyrant. These features are a recurring preoccupation of my comparison, which takes the Baroque less as a historical period than a recurring aesthetic strategy manifesting itself in a series of movements, periods, and genres throughout the modern era. The Gothic, symbolism, expressionism, surrealism, as well as both avant-garde and popular art at the beginning of the 21st century. By recognizing these aesthetic modes as descendants of the Baroque, I not only propose a subterranean genealogy for the aesthetic critique of modernity that develops in opposition to a dominant, though never static, aesthetic of mimetic realism, but I also contend that what mobilizes these anti-mimetic aesthetics of distortion, spectacle, fantasy, and allegory is the descent from modern hegemonies motivated by a dislocation from dominant understandings of temporality, history, and time. That is to say, that the peripheral modernist sees, feels, and experiences time differently from the mainstream culture. The perception of belatedness with respect to a dominant mode of representation provokes an aesthetic practice that becomes anticipatory of a subsequent form of cultural production. This dynamic, I believe, is best illustrated by the development of Yiddish literature. During the heyday of Baroque aesthetics in the late 17th and early 18th century, although there was no shortage of writing in Yiddish, there were essentially no new Yiddish narratives produced in what would today be recognized as modern literary forms. When modern Yiddish literature begins, with, among other literary productions, the publication of Reb Nachman of Breslav's stories, discussed in the second part of my book, their aesthetic character is Baroque in several ways, which I discuss. Reb Nachman's literary activity, only one aspect of his often manic and always remarkable career as a religious thinker and leader, coincides with the birth of European Romanticism and the heyday of the Gothic novel, cultural events of which he would have been almost completely unaware. Yet, the juxtaposition of his Baroque tales with the Gothic novel demonstrates the many similarities between these aesthetic discourses. Similarly, the influence of Reb Nachman on subsequent neo-Romantic Yiddish authors indicates the proximity of Gothic aesthetics with late 19th century symbolism. By the time one considers Yiddish symbolists such as Danister and his contemporaries, their work coincides with the era of surrealism and expressionism. Yiddish literature in the interwar context, while participating surreptitiously in the culture of Weimar Germany, also provides an index to a history of anti-mimetic narrative forms in the modern era, not because it is identical to the co-territorial literatures it abuts, but because it is often so radically different. By the same token, the characteristics of belatedness and a failure to coincide with a temporal framework that insists on synchronicity pertain to our current moment, for which the catch-all concept postmodern signifies only that previous social and aesthetic consensuses no longer apply to the present era, even if a new vocabulary or even a new name for our contemporaneity has yet to emerge. The postmodern is Baroque, insofar as the Baroque itself was proto-modern, combining a pre-modern worldview with the material circumstances of an incompletely understood present. That unsettled feeling of not coinciding with the present moment prompts a longing for bypassed periods, either as a means of connecting to a tradition of continuity and belonging, or alternately as a romance of previous eras in which a historical possibility of dynamic change and aesthetic experimentation provides a reproach to a current moment of mechanical, mass-produced materialist culture. Benjamin associates melancholy with the 17th century Baroque and its cultivation of allegory, but one recognizes that the concept applies with equal pertinence to the Weimar era, and especially to the temperament of his own work. Writing of the French poet Charles Baudelaire, Benjamin observes, quote, Baudelaire was a bad philosopher, a good theoretician, but only as a brooder, a gribbler, was he incomparable, end quote. This characterization applies as much to Benjamin himself and maybe to myself as well. The attention that Benjamin devotes to the concept of melancholy bypasses Sigmund Freud's symptomatic clinical differentiation of mourning, a seemingly organic process, from melancholy, a neurotic manifestation, to return to the origins of the concept of melancholy in medieval theories of the body. What defines melancholy against mourning for Benjamin, unlike Freud, is not a distinction in degree, but a difference in kind. As Elite Ferber explains, quote, the melancholic mourns what he has not yet lost, but also what was never his to lose, end quote. In this respect, I'd like to contend that the relationship of traditional Jewish culture, of German Jews such as Benjamin, Döblin, Arnold Zweig, even Gershom Scholem, is one of melancholy, whereas for Yiddish writers like Bergelsen, Danister, and Kolbach, it is one of mourning. To be certain, the loss of tradition is not something that interwar Yiddish or Hebrew writers imagined. It was a trauma they experienced, observing the horrific devastation of the shtetl culture that Arnold Zweig has apostrophized. Even if prior to World War I, they had looked forward to the emancipation that a freedom from tradition had promised. If German Jewish radicals such as Arnold Zweig romanticize Yiddish culture to resist their familial legacy of bourgeois gentility and German nationalism, Yiddish writers witness the destruction of their parents' world firsthand. The distinction between Yiddish mourning and German melancholia accounts for the unaffiliated, abstracted cosmopolitanism through which writers such as Benjamin, Döblin, or Josef Roth expressed their sense of Jewishness. And the explicitly Jewish character of Yiddish authors returning to the Soviet Union, or the disparate Zionist affiliations of Scholem, Arnold Zweig, or the Yiddish and Hebrew poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg. These are the considerations that determined the parameters of my research. Among the Yiddish writers, journalists, and community activists who passed through Berlin during the Weimar Republic, I concentrated on the ones who returned from Germany to the Soviet Union. Among the German Jewish figures who participated in public life in interwar Berlin, I focused primarily on Jews who identified publicly with Jewishness, yet who expressed this Jewishness through the radically cosmopolitan route of what can be considered a permanent exile. The mourning of the Yiddish authors I consider accounts for their decision to return to the Soviet Union in order to rebuild a Yiddish homeland there through communism, whereas the German Jews on whom I concentrate can neither remain in Germany at the end of the Weimar Republic, for obvious reasons, nor can they adopt anything other than a provisional understanding of home, because as melancholics, they had lost both a physical location for home and faith in the concept of home as such. The melancholia that motivates the ideological choices of these figures also characterizes the fate of many of them. Walter Benjamin commits suicide while fleeing the Nazis from France to Spain in 1940. Josef Roth, who died from the effects of acute alcoholism even before World War II had begun, might as well be considered a suicide. Moshe Kulbach, like most of the Yiddish cultural activists in Soviet Minsk, was a victim of the Great Purge in the 1930s. Bannister and Bergelsen, who, unlike Kulbach, had become committed activists in the Soviet Union, achieved international prominence during World War II as members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, invested with the task of promoting the Soviet war effort among Jews abroad. Because of their association with American Jewish leaders, as well as the enthusiasm of many Jews in the Soviet Union for the State of Israel, by 1948, the now disbanded committee was accused of treason. Not in spite, but because of their importance to the state and the party, they were tried, convicted, tortured, and killed by the government they had served. Although I could not know it when I began researching this comparison, the world today faces some of the same threats that destroyed the Weimar Republic. Eastern Europe, and Russia in particular, are being drawn into a widening gyre of authoritarianism, intolerance, and corruption. Europe generally seems in danger of dissolving into ever more fractious xenophobic nation states, and paradoxically, the most localized nationalist movements in places such as Spain and the United Kingdom suggest more durable democratic models than the federated yet increasingly isolationist nation states from which they would secede. The United States and Israel are less immune to these dangers than could have been imagined a decade ago when I began researching this project. In the face of these hazards, including the risks posed by acquiescence, passivity, and despair, the culture of Weimar Germany offers a cautionary lesson and several individual models for the pursuit of freedom, the dignity of the individual, and the value of the community. Many of the figures in this comparison can be said to have given their life for these values, less as conscious martyrs than sacrificial victims. One should not romanticize the condition of the cosmopolitans, however much each of them was prone to romanticize himself. Rather, the displacement each suffered and the tragedy that befell so many of them serves as a moral obligation to each citizen and every nation to provide a home to the homeless, a refuge to the refugee. Not because nature recognizes some people as natives and others as transients, but because the lesson of history, the lesson of eminence, the lesson of allegory calls continuously to mind the fact that on a planet eternally in motion, all homes are forever fleeting. The authors and artists in this study attest to the historical complexity, social significance, and formal brilliance of aesthetic modernism. By understanding the philosophical motivations for their aesthetic choices, the meaning of these works can be understood in ethical terms as well as formal ones. Every work in my study rewards an engagement with its difficulties, its ambiguities, and its eloquence. It is hoped that their juxtaposition in my work will also reward the patience of its readers with new insights into literary form, Jewish culture, and the continuities, whether as menace or as promise, between Weimar and now. Thank you.
Shall I go?
Please do.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Mark, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dustin, for organizing this. I'll try to keep my comments brief, and as I told you earlier, with formulated as questions mostly for a conversation. And I'm going to try to kind of touch on, in some sense, the three main scholarly fields that the book kind of intervenes in and is in conversation with, namely three that I am kind of most acutely aware of, I guess, or most found most interesting when I reread the book now, which is comparative literature Jewish studies, and then sort of through Benjamin, I'm going to call it philosophy of history, and that's already sort of the beginning of a question mark maybe, but I'll get to that. So even just in this very rich talk, you already got a sense of the sort of how rich this book is, how much Marc manages to encompass. And even though he now gave you this impression that it's it's organized in 3 parts, Benjamin is the main theoretical interlocutor, you get a sense that there's a scope to this book. And it befalls to me to break the news that really this book is about everything, and is precisely kind of, it's about the experience of the loss of borders, and it is also borderless. And it seems to me, and that's kind of in some sense my first question, I'd love to hear you talk more about that as an ethos. And it's present in the book. I mean, it's an incredibly pleasurable book to read because I almost felt like, you get on the Marc Caplan train of associations and connections, and you ride with it. And increasingly, as the book kind of, as you, the contemporary connections and associations, they're there right from the start in playful titles and in sort of nods to various kind of pop cultural things, and right in the style of your writing. But increasingly that sort of comes to the surface, and by the end, we understand the Baroque through Frank Ocean, and Schoenberg through we get to Angels in America, and finally to Disney, Pixar, and Wall-E, right? And increasingly there's sort of this, you bring out of the closet in some sense, something that seems to me to be a fundamental ethos of your work, which is this sort of almost like a promiscuity, right? A refusal of what's proper and what is within the field, and a constantly sort of pushing back against that. And I find it sometimes challenging, almost sort of oceanic, right? But incredibly pleasurable, and just sort of, so I wanted to invite you to just say more about that, if you will. And because it seems to me that that's the question that I would kind of pose as a question, being about comparative literature, that there's something here beyond kind of the work that you do. I mean, I should say, having sort of tried to playfully emulate your style and say that it's about everything, that as a book about Yiddish literature, and as a book about German Jewish, and then more generally sort of Weimar German literature, it's incredibly rich, right? That within those 2 fields, your book is also, it's not just about the texts, about the text that it purports to be about, but that it almost feels to me like there's never a comparison between 2 things that you don't find at least 1/3 to roll onto, and that's part of your dialectical and comparatist thinking. So in order to speak about Yiddish modernism, you have to expand and talk about an entire history, right? In order to talk about any particular author, you have to expand and speak about a whole rich, kind of very diverse field, and that this becomes a kind of almost like a machine that then keeps producing and connecting. And I'm just, first of all, just want to share with you all who are about to read the book that that's part of the kind of the reward that it produces, or that it delivers, and part of its challenges. So I guess moving to my second question, which in some sense is my Jewish studies question, I was just trying to think about, to kind of understand for myself, right, that there's a sort of, the Weimar Germany and Weimar Berlin in particular just has this incredible charisma, right? It's this, and one of the things that fascinates me about what you do in this book is that I to this moment, cannot fully decide whether you capitalize on it or whether you've come to completely deconstruct and kind of deflate that charisma. Because I think you do maybe both, right? And that's, I find that also very interesting and very compelling, right? That there's something, and in recent years in the US, this notion of like, oh, we're in Weimar Berlin, any minute now, the world will erupt in the violence, that dread, and that, but also that fascination, has been an interesting resource, but also a very problematic one. And what, of course, you're not writing an op-ed about how we are and are not similar to Weimar Berlin, but I think you do something that also precisely speaks to that longing and that its problems in some sense, or that longing for a useful parallel and its limits. Yeah, and I guess why is it that Weimar Berlin is so charismatic and so attractive? And part of it is this incredible wealth, this richness, that it's so many different things, right? That kind of any attempt to, you make a TV series about it, what was it called? Babylon Berlin, right?
Yeah.
You'll miss 70 things that are not there, right? And even as just that, it's already very, very rich, and yet so much is missing from it. And there's something about, it seems to me that the Yiddish authors that you discuss, the way that you read them, you're saying that they are most quintessentially of that place because they are the most different, right? You sort of said that today as well, and I found that very, very interesting. So I guess this is where I ask kind of I do the academic move that is, well, how does this relate to my thing? And ask you sort of, so you, of course, Hebrew literature comes in at various moments, and Zionism as well, but you know, that's one of the things that I've been thinking about and studying is how at that moment, there are all these Hebrew authors who are also moving through the same space. You mentioned you have a really lovely reading of Agnon's Adhena, kind of in a nutshell. You kind of explode that text and do a lot with it, but there are many others. And I guess to formulate it as a useful question, one way of thinking about it is sort of, what would your book look like if those were also, if that option, beyond kind of in addition to the German Jewish and the Yiddish option, took a larger space, and the way that I kind of tried to think through that, I mean, it's a silly question, right? What would have happened if you had written a different book that whatever. But I think that this very elegant, right? It's by juxtaposing Freud on mourning and melancholia and Benjamin on these same concepts, you come up with this really kind of dazzling, the distinction between the Yiddishists as the ones who are in mourning, and the German Jewish authors are the ones who are kind of steeped in melancholia. And you sort of say that the Hebrew authors experience that same loss that led to a mourning, but it really, that moment I found really kind of, what was on my mind when I was reading it was trying to imagine, well, how does Zionism, the kind of the vision of Zionism, how would we articulate? Is it just sort of this happy puppy that's blissfully unaware, or how would that enter into that taxonomy, that dichotomy? It's maybe almost beyond melancholia in that it's a mourning that never fully kind of in post-war Israel, post-state, post-Holocaust Israel, there's a kind of, and that's when Agnon writes the novel that you write about, there's a sort of resistance to fully metabolizing the mourning and something like that. I guess, so finally, kind of to go back to kind of your dialogue with Benjamin and the way that you use, I found incredibly clarifying your sort of description and use of the concepts of allegory and the Baroque especially. And I guess that this also kind of returns to my point that the book is about everything, and that also the kind of elegant way in which you constantly remind us that all of this work is helpful for understanding the present. I mean, I wanted to pull out one quote from what you just read to us that really opens this up for me, right? That you talk about the way that the achievements of Weimar modernism and Benjamin's work, paramount among them, serve as a resource for understanding the sleeping strength of contemporary aesthetics, its status for the future that every era designated by the prefix post maintains. And I guess that's where I was just kind of trying to think through all of the posts that we find ourselves in, the precise, even kind of course, this is pushing you even further beyond kind of, you said that you weren't thinking about the Trump era when you wrote the book. And here we are in the post-Trump era. And how do we continue to think? That's yet another post that leaves us in a kind of a state of conundrum yet again, right? And I guess that's my way of asking, in a sense, like whether you think we'll ever not be Baroque at this point, right? And I meant another variation on that same question, I guess, for me is to say, right, you end with this reading of Wally that you read as a kind of allegory, or yeah, as an allegory of thinking about history. But it brought to mind, I'll tell an anecdote that's also, I feel like I'm emulating you in that as well. My daughter, when she was 4, watched that movie. And then a few days after that, we got in the car and drove out of Chicago into the industrial wasteland that lies between here and Michigan, Gary, Indiana. And she looked out of the window and said, "Is that Wally?" But I think, to me, it's that sort of that we don't even need to imagine the future anymore as the pile of debris, and that we live in this moment of that where the precarity is planetary, right? Anyone on this spinning planet is in movement, but also the entire thing now kind of faces this, we're sort of too late. Our Baroque existence has to do with kind of the belatedness of even facing that crisis, and our inability to, right, belated and anticipatory. Our relationship to environmental destruction is of that same structure. So on that hopeful note, I guess that's kind of, I wanted to invite you to also think more about, or talk more to the kind of the way that the concept of Baroque, in its kind of the kind of temporality that it captures, keeps yielding insights to the present.
Thank you so much, Nama, for your kind and your generous and your extraordinarily stimulating reading, really, in a sense, throughout this project. I mean, you have been, one of my secret interlocutors throughout. So I'm really grateful to be able to express my thanks to you and to hear your comments today. While I was writing the book, I would be in a museum, or I'd be in a car, or I would be watching movies with my children, who, my daughter was about 5 when I began writing this book, and now she's 16. And I would say, "Oh, I write about this in my book. I write about that in my book." And they would frequently, over the course of a decade-long conversation, they would say, "What are you writing your book about again? What is this? How can you be writing about all these different things?" I said, "Well, I'll have to show it to you when it comes out. Do you want to read it when I publish it?" And they would always say, "No, we have no interest in reading it, because they're children and they're healthy and they have better things to do with their life." But I think that, what you refer to, Nama, as an ethos of connectivity, there is a lot of desire that motivates that work ethic. And one desire is, of course, to resist compartmentalization, to resist the idea that academic writing only has to be in one mode, only has to be in one mood, only has to be about one subject. This book is an ongoing protest to the concept of a monograph. But I think that, to connect it to the themes that I've tried to draw out tonight, my writers were refugees. And when one thinks about the status of a refugee, the fundamental characterization of that condition is invisibility. They are unseen. And yet they are everywhere. They are everywhere because they receive no acknowledgement, because they have no fixed status. They become connections, culturally, temporally, politically, territorially, geographically. In so many ways, they are the connections that create a global culture. So I wanted to write in that spirit, that the topics, the discourse of my book insists upon interconnectivity, because it is the status of being a refugee, it is the status of being a fugitive, it is the status of being a wanderer that creates those connections. It is a desire to bring the peripheral to the center. Now, historical circumstances brings the peripheral today as 100 years ago from the margins to Berlin, to the city capital, to the world city, makes of the city a metropolis. But I think if we can think about, and I'm going to be deliberately playful here, and I apologize if it comes across as glib, but I mean, you know me by now, Nama. That if we can think about the easy proximity of the terms peripheral and proliferate, that there is something about that energy of the margins seeping in, moving out, going everywhere, diffusing into a space. That's the status of the refugee writer, the refugee culture, the cultural vagabond. It's also the methodology of what I was writing. To put it in ways that draw more explicitly on some of the conceptual terms that I deal with in my book, if we think about the philosophical concept of the monad, that moment of intersection where a particularity becomes universal, and the universal is concentrated into a particular. The monad, M-O-N-A-D, is the nomad. The concepts are interconnected. There's just one letter of difference. It's just one reversal. And of course, for my own status as a wanderer, some would say I'm a bit of a wanderer myself, it might be said. I understand that that condition of nomadity, that culture of nomadology. Bringing this back to the Weimar Republic, and sometimes as I talk about this, I recently published a little essay on my publisher's website. They invited me to do this. I was very happy to do so, about the motivations of my book. I talked about, there's silent film in this book. There's modernist opera. There's performance art. There's Pixar movies. There's hip hop. But fundamentally, it remains a book about the Weimar Republic. And I don't want to, there is not, hundreds of pages about Pixar movies. There are 5 pages about Pixar movies. I want to put this into perspective. But I think that what you describe as the charisma of the Weimar Republic and that competing sense of cynicism, the way in which the Weimar Republic creates a new culture that dismantles itself rapidly and shockingly and abrasively. I think that one of the things that makes Weimar compelling to us, that serves us both as a mode of inspiration and as a cautionary example, and someone like Theodor Adorno, another product of the Weimar, explicitly Jewish culture, would say, every example is a cautionary example, if you really pay attention to it, is the poetics of apocalypse that were so fundamental to the Weimar situation. Apocalypse really signifies a condition in which one is not able to name oneself. What is the future going to bring? When I was in high school, I could not imagine what life would be like graduating from high school. I I would try to write poems, or I would try to write stories because I was a 16-year-old, and they would they would always exist in this kind of no man's land, because life beyond what I knew was unimaginable. Now, for a 16-year-old, I think that's completely appropriate. That says something about the psychology of being 16. But where I'm going with this idea is that the predicament of Weimar culture, the predicament of interwar culture in a lot of spaces in Europe and in the United States, was this inability to imagine for yourself a future. And that leads to apocalyptic ideas. The future, you don't know what it is, you know that it is something annihilating. And that, I think, characterizes a lot of aspects of the Weimar imagination. Which goes to maybe the most fundamental, or maybe the most urgent question that you pose about the role of Zionism in all of this. You pose the idea, is Zionism, the happy alternative to this apocalyptic imagination? Well, first of all, I can't think of any happier place on earth right now than the Middle East. But, I think that the idea of Zionism ultimately is not that different from the investment in a reconceptualized homeland that my Yiddish guys cultivate with the Soviet Union. 1929, I mean, to bring us back to 1929, there were no historical bets that would say Zionism would work and the Soviet Union would not work. There were no clear bets on that. And at least insofar as one is a Yiddish writer, you are making a very appropriate calculated risk in throwing your lot with the Soviet Union. Now, that risk was certainly betrayed by history, but we don't expect people to have, these are writers, these are not prophets. They have no foresight any better than we do. I think that Zionism represents an ultimately more radical idea of recovery from mourning than the itinerary of going back from Berlin to Moscow. Because the homeland that Zionism creates ultimately becomes a synthetic Europe superimposed onto Palestine. It is a prosthetic homeland. And that notion of prosthesis, and Hebrew becomes a kind of prosthetic mamaloshin. It becomes a kind of retooled, a postmodern native tongue. That notion of prosthesis connects us to a lot of the anxieties about what kind of future is imaginable for us today. All of this goes back to a couple of ideas, and I'm going to conclude with this. One idea, and we still have a few minutes left to take questions or to continue the conversation. One of these ideas is the anxiety that not having a name engenders. We don't know what to call ourselves in the 21st century. We just know that we're postmodern. We don't know what the future will be. We're only post-Trumpian. We don't create our own structures. We're merely post-structuralists. That postness actually bespeaks our children and our grandchildren and our students, if we're lucky enough to keep having students, they're going to call us something that's going to be very clear. Our predicament is going to be very obvious to people 15 years from now, 20 years from now. We are blind to it now. Our eyes are only turned on the past. But the miracle of human beings that Benjamin's angel of history does not possess is the ability to turn our head. So we will turn our heads eventually when we're able to, when we have a word, when we have a direction to look at. The other point I want to make, and with this conclude, is I really wanted to talk about Pixar and Wall-E at the end of the book, because I wanted to talk about hope. And that is the other promise that works of art make for us. Even very bleak works of art, even very difficult works of art, even very melancholic works of art offer us hope simply because they exist. And I wanted to invest in that energy at the end of the book, not to think about 1933 as the end of the book, but as an end of history that becomes the beginning of a new now. Discuss among yourselves.
Okay, thank you very, very much, both of you, for that, especially the discussion at the end. Let me just open up the chat here. So we don't have a ton of time, unfortunately. So does anyone have a question? I'm just going to ask, and we can just, Allison, they can unmute themselves, or do you have to unmute them? I think you can unmute yourself.
They can unmute themselves.
Okay, so if you don't mind, just if you have a question, unmute yourself, ask it, and maybe, does anyone want to go first? I can't unfortunately see everyone all at once here. So does anyone want to volunteer?
Or is there a raise your hand function that can?
There is a little raise your hand function. I've got several pages of people, so I'll flip back and forth between them. Does anyone want to go first? It is a heady talk, so I understand if you're afraid, especially my students, but into the abyss. Anyone? Or else I'll be forced to tire you all with one of my questions, which I can always ask later. Okay, I know everyone is shy online. Well, I will ask my question then. I'll take my prerogative unless someone else. Actually, Nama, do you have anything else you want to push on, given that you've just heard a response to a response, and I can always pester Marc on my own later?
Well, yeah, it was a fabulous response, very thought-provoking and such a rich response to the response. Now I'm curious to hear your question too, Dustin, if you.
Yeah.
No, it's actually very vague, which is it. Oh, actually, Carly has a question. Carly.
Okay, it might be kind of a simple question, so I apologize if this comes off as just kind of silly, but you said that we now kind of live in a post-Holocaust Israel where there's resistance to fully metabolize the morning, and now we're in a post-Trump conundrum. And you said that, like, and at the end of your talk, you said that now works of art offer us hope just because they're here. But thinking back to when you were talking about how we're currently living, kind of, we're past the Baroque stage of mourning because we're living through like kind of it now. And I'm sorry if I'm kind of mushing up all of your words. My notebook is kind of all over the place. So would you say that works of art, let's say, that could be produced now, that are in a post-Trump kind of, we're looking back at, we're too late for the environment, could those still provide hope, or are those kind of works of art that are going to say something like hope is gone because it's too late for us?
I think, my response would be a couple of things. First of all, I think we do see a lot of very meaningful work that is a commentary on what's happening environmentally, politically, socially. 2020 has been a very good year for art. That doesn't mean that we should hope for more epidemics and more outbreaks of police brutality and more repression. I don't hope for that, but I recognize that we do continue to make thoughtful and compelling critiques through the production of art. Contemporary art is just as significant and just as worthy of our attention as art that was created 100 years ago or 400 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Our resistance to simple modes of history is part of what complicates our cultural productions. I think the other thing that's really interesting to me, works of art that were created 5 years ago, 6 years ago, are period pieces now. They refer back to a completely irretrievable historical dispensation. Just little examples of that. You know, a whole nation was beguiled by the musical Hamilton in 2015, my children included, you know, and you know, I don't know how many of you still listen to the Hamilton soundtrack. I do still listen to it just because I listen to lots of stuff. And the point is, there's something uniquely 2015 about that. That musical only makes sense in the backdrop of an Obama presidency. It doesn't have the same resonances now that it did then, but it's still valuable to us as an index of what it felt like to be alive in 2016. There is art that was produced in 2020 that is an irreplaceable artifact for what it felt like to live under the burden of the pressures that 2020 dropped on our shoulders. And we're going to return to those works of art both as cultural resources and as modes of inspiration. If you could produce that song, if you could produce that album, if you could produce that movie during Black Lives Matter, then maybe I can turn in this term paper. You know, maybe, you know, I can persevere in my day-to-day life as well, even when my burdens are not as great as that moment was.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much.
Vasily, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Nama. It's really great talk and great comments. And I have a really a technical question. Most of the people who you're discussing moved from east to west and west to east, and I'm asking about Benjamin himself, who visited Moscow 26th, 27th, I believe. And do you have anything on this in your book? And perhaps whatever, well, the question could be framed like, who was his interlocutors in Moscow? What he thought in Moscow?
So one of his interlocutors in Moscow, remarkably, was Joseph Roth. The only time that I know Walter Benjamin and Joseph Roth met one another. And of course, Roth at the time was one of the most prominent and famous journalists, one of the most famous German language writers in the world. Benjamin very much was not, you know, but they were both staying in the same hotel in 1926, and they were both experiencing, for very, very different reasons, a profound disenchantment with the allure, with the romance of Soviet communism. For Benjamin, this was a literal disenchantment with romance because he'd gone to Moscow in pursuit of a woman named Asya Leitzis, a Latvian communist who had collaborated with Bertolt Brecht in Berlin and then gone back to the Soviet Union. He fell in love, madly in love with her. I have no firm evidence that it was ever remotely reciprocated. You know, he could be quite frantic in his pursuit of romance. But he went to Moscow hoping to, you know, seduce her, and he failed catastrophically. But for him, ultimately, the lesson of the Soviet Union was it wasn't revolutionary enough. And for Roth, the disillusionment was it was too modern. You know, it was you know, what the Soviet Union was doing to become a new nation was modernizing itself in similar ways that a lot of people who went to Palestine in the same era were disenchanted with the desire of, you know, the mainstream Zionists to build a modern nation. We don't, you know, you shouldn't be desiring modernity. You should be just hoeing and, you know, plowing and, you know, harvesting, and that's all you need. You don't need, you know, and so they turn their attention. Their writing, each of them changes as a result of this encounter with the Soviet Union. And I think it's emblematic of that fact, is emblematic of the fact that, you know, the Yiddish writers, you understand why they went back to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was in the 1920s investing in the Yiddish language, investing in Yiddish publishing houses, Yiddish educational infrastructure. It made sense for them to be interested in the Soviet Union. There was no investment in German language culture, to speak of in the Soviet Union, yet the Germans could not take their eyes off of what was happening in the Soviet Union. So their understanding of modernity was filtered through the Soviet experiment as profoundly as the Yiddish writers were. And this is a dynamic that I really only came to understand through the juxtaposition of the Yiddish with the German Jewish radical culture.
Thank you. Thanks.
I missed the last question. Let's see if I can see. Does anyone have a question? Just please talk. Apparently I'm just very bad at seeing my screen. So if you have a question, just say it. Anyone? Bueller? My question initially concerned Spencer, but then I think that'll drag us far too far afield. I have a slight concern with our sort of, again, nostalgia for Weimar. And the model I'm using is, so Weimar obviously had a sort of infatuation with 18th century thought, like a lot of the thinkers then. And I'm wondering if our nostalgia for Weimar in any way echoes their own nostalgia for, let's call it, high and late Enlightenment Germany. And if there's anything we can learn from that in order to avoiding the sort of same, there was a certain naivete with the way they approached this past. And I wonder sometimes if there's this whole, obviously there's the Holocaust is coming at the end of it, et cetera, et cetera. But during the time, the humanities were fun, like the humanities were blooming, right? We needed. And I'm wondering if there's not a way, if there's any sort of, we can use them to actually push back against our own nostalgia for them and a sort of longing for the period of Adorno or Benjamin. I don't know if I may be misreading because I'm not a historian, but
well, I think that we're all nostalgic for a time when funding of the humanities was blooming. I think that we're justified in that nostalgia.
maybe.
I think that you raise a lot of different possibilities in terms of answering. One possibility is to say that my own research is going back to some of the philosophical sources that motivated the Weimar writers and that motivated people like Benjamin and Adorno, going back to people like Lessing and Kant specifically. So more on that next time. I think that, one of the things that motivates nostalgia, and this is something that I actually say in a footnote in my introduction, but I elaborate on it later. There are two words for experience in German. There is a notion of Erlebnis and there's a notion of Erfahrung. Erlebnis is that experience. Wow, man, last night was such an experience, man. That's one kind of experience. Erfahrung is the experience you get from patient, steady practice at something. One is the experience that comes as inspiration. The other comes as experience as a method. And for Benjamin, we see this impoverishment of the notion of experience. So going to the past becomes a means of reacquainting ourselves with something artisanal, something that's man-made, not machine-made, something that's genuine, something that's authentic. We claim in 2021 to have, rid ourselves of the notion of authenticity. Authenticity is a very, 1950s concept, 1960s concept. We don't, I'm not sure I'm not sure if we've disabused ourselves of that concept as fully as we imagine ourselves to have done. I think that nostalgia is motivated by a quest for authenticity, but that nostalgia is always going to be a frustrated search, because the further back you go, the further estranged you are from your own moment. And maybe in that respect, the Weimar Republic can serve as a cautionary example for us. And maybe it can offer us a mode of contemplation as we continue to await the naming of our own present tense.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to end with, I appreciate that, and I'm going to pester you more on Facebook later about that. We're going to end with Adnan, Dr. Hussein's question, please. And then I'll say some things and you can all disappear into the ether.
Well, thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk. I don't know much about this era. I'm a medievalist, so when you mentioned about melancholia and the theory of medieval melancholia, I got interested. But I wanted to actually ask you about a Weimar figure who was a medievalist, and I wondered if this is a different trajectory, how it would fit, whether you talk about him in your book. But I was thinking less about these cosmopolitan leftist conceptual theorists and these Yiddish kind of maybe left Marxist writers. Somebody like Ernst Kantorowicz, who was part of the Georgia Kreis and was involved in some of this Germanic, romantic recovery of this nationalist ideal, and what kind of a response that is in terms of this emotional orientation about loss, mourning versus melancholia. Is there a different sort of register, or would you relate this kind of more right-wing cultural aesthetic orientation along this axis somehow? I just wondered about your thoughts about a very odd and interesting figure like him.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was certainly on Walter Benjamin's radar, and Walter Benjamin, unique among the engaged left-wing intellectuals of his time, was very actively seeking out dialogue with very, very right-wing figures. And for Benjamin, it was almost this notion that we have. It's a very commonplace notion that at some point the spectrums join again, where Benjamin cultivated that belief, that there is a positive energy, there is a progressive energy to be unleashed from studying these reactionary sources. And this comes from his notion of the value of the obsolescent and the displaced, and that which is outside of time has an energy that can inform the future. So, there's a whole host of figures that Benjamin is engaging with in correspondence and in personal relationships and in writing from the very far right. And for Benjamin, I'd say that this quest for authenticity, this quest for the artisanal, this quest for the genuine experience, not the sensationalist experience, not the mechanized experience, but the genuine experience is something that connects the right to the left. That we're all ultimately trying to get back to a sense of community that modernity has erased and rendered impossible. The difference for Benjamin, and I think for Benjamin this is fundamental. Now maybe we can say that this is naive, but it's still worth distinguishing because some people don't want to make this distinction. Benjamin wants to turn mechanization itself into something revolutionary. He doesn't want to break the machines. He doesn't want to return to blood and soil. He's nobody's farmer. He wants to make the contemporary moment revolutionary, not turn back the clock, because he knows that our contemporary moment, because he knows that Berlin in 1927 is going to be some other culture, some later culture's ancient artifact. And he knows that they will have a revolutionary energy for the future to harness, the way that the reactionaries are trying to harness this bygone medieval energy in the 1920s. And very quickly, I just want to say in the conclusion, at the end of my book, I talk about the movie Metropolis. Metropolis was made in 1926. It debuted in 1927. It's set in 2026, and this is an uncomfortably close moment to the completion of my own book. You know, 100 years in the future has now become our present tense. And when the movie came out, everybody said, well, it's obvious that the future is going to be nothing like this. You know, and people made a cottage industry of pointing out what was fantastic about the future in the vision of this film. Well, what's the film about? It's about this single corporation controls all of human production, and every human worker is enslaved by it. Well, you know, that's also, you know, the premise of what happens in Wall-E in 2008. Is it really as, it's not as far-fetched as people hoped it would be in 1927. So I think that there is the intentions of the Weimar Republic, and then there's the energy of the Weimar Republic. I try to understand the intentions in order to harness the energy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a great question and a wonderful answer. And I want to thank everyone for coming. I know it's late. I really appreciate it. I want to thank Marc Caplan, Nama Rokem most especially. I really appreciate you guys spending your time to go over your work with us. And I hope you all have a good evening, or what is left of it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Nama.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
For me too. Thank you, everyone.